Let me show you how easy it is to take my newest gluten-free sourdough recipe to make a small round loaf, a few buns, or bake the dough in a bread pan. If you haven't created a gluten-free sourdough starter yet, check out the links below and then come back to this video once you're ready to give this recipe a try. Check out the video's description for timestamps. It will help you access each option faster if you watch the video multiple times. And if you're wondering why I created yet another bread recipe, know that sourdough is popular, but not everyone can consume the same ingredients. In the past, I've customized many gluten-free vegan recipes to also be free of oat, rice, nut, corn, and legume flour. This particular recipe is my all-time favorite, which is why I wanted to share it with you. Let's begin. In the evening, or whatever suits your schedule best, take out your starter from the fridge, if that's where you keep it in between bakes. Feed it, cover it, and set it aside overnight to transform into wild yeast. First thing in the morning, follow the recipe's instructions, but basically you want to feed your starter a second time in order to achieve lots of bubbling activity, which in turn will help you make the best bread. Let me show you. For the first feeding, you don't really need to measure. I simply scoop out some brown rice flour from the bag or container and pour in just enough water to stir. You can follow the recipe for the second feeding, as it's important to create enough starter for the recipe, which is 265 grams or 1 cup. To keep things tidy, don't forget to clean the sides of your jar before you cover it. The goal is to refresh your starter in order to get as lively as possible. The best signs to show you that it's ready are the gorgeous bubbles, the wonderful aroma, and the popping activity if you were to stir it a little. Once your starter reaches its peak of liveliness, which is often within 2 to 4 hours of a feeding, it is the best time to use it. For the next step, get all your bread ingredients ready. If you have a kitchen scale, I recommend weighing your ingredients for this recipe. You will need to decide if you want to mix the dough by hand or with a stand mixer. From my experience with this recipe, using a stand mixer will give you a more open and airy crumb, but both methods will achieve the same yummy, soft, and flavorful taste. No matter if you decide to make a loaf, buns, or bake the dough in a bread pan, the process of combining and mixing the ingredients is the same. Before the next step, weigh 265 grams of starter and set it aside. If you're mixing by hand, you can go ahead and weigh the water, whole psyllium husk, maple syrup, and olive oil directly into the mixing bowl and give it a good whisk. If you're using a stand mixer, mix these first ingredients well for a few minutes. Also, just a quick note for the water temperature. Your dough might rise faster if the water you use is between 70 to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. If your water and kitchen are very cold, the dough might take longer to rise. You don't want to use hot water, but room temp to slightly warm water will work very well. For the dry ingredients, if it's easier, you can combine them in a separate bowl and give them a quick whisk to mix everything up and break any bits of flour or starch. Or you can get messy like me and sift them into the mixing bowl or stand mixer bowl. If mixing by hand, you can start with a soft spatula, then add the starter and finish mixing by hand until the dough is well combined and comes together nicely. A good tip, if you have dry hands, is to wet them first or rub a little olive oil on them before you mix by hand. For the dough, if you still have some dry ingredients left at the bottom of your bowl, this is when you can consider adding 1, maybe 2 extra tablespoons of water to help you bring the dough together in a smooth ball. If using a mixer, you will need to mix for a few minutes, scrape down the attachment a few times if it's sticking, and only add a touch more water to help you if necessary. Once the dough is combined, you can use your hands to bring the dough in a nice, smooth ball. The next step will depend on if you're making a round loaf, baking the dough in a bread pan, or making a few buns. Let's start with the round, freeform loaf, also known as a boule. If you have a 7-inch Banneton basket, you can dust it with a little brown rice flour. If you don't have a basket, you can use a soup bowl that's about 7 inches and line it with a clean tea towel dusted with flour. For this dough, no kneading is required, although you can manipulate the dough a little to form a smoother ball. Place the smoothest side down in the basket. This step is optional, but I like to insert my basket in a reusable bag to help rise the dough, or you can cover the dough with a tea towel. Find a cozy spot in the kitchen and let the dough rise for 3 to 5 hours. The dough is ready to bake once it shows some growth, usually half to 1 inch in height. The dough will not double in size, but should spring back if gently pressed down with a finger. Before we continue, preheat your oven, Dutch oven, and baking stone if you have one for a good 30 to 60 minutes before baking your bread. This recipe bakes at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. A great tip is to position the oven rack on the lower half so the Dutch oven will be centered when baking. Before the next few steps, remove the preheated Dutch oven from the oven. Be careful, it will be hot. Once ready to bake, flip the dough onto a piece of parchment paper. Brush off excess flour. Use a bread lamb or sharp knife to score one line across the dough about 1/4 inch deep. Extra decorative lines are optional. For inspiration, please see examples in the recipe post. Place the dough with parchment paper into the hot Dutch oven. This step is optional, but adding a few ice cubes to the hot Dutch oven will create steam to help with the rise. Placing the ice on the side of the paper is perfect. Transfer to the oven and bake covered for 40 minutes and uncovered for another 40 minutes. The bread is ready when the crust is hard and darker in color and sounds hollow all around when tapped, or reaches an internal temperature of approximately 210, although I haven't checked a loaf this way yet. Once ready, remove paper and cool on a wire rack for 4 to 6 hours before you enjoy a slice. This gluten-free sourdough bread recipe is free of wheat, gluten, eggs, dairy, nuts, corn, and legumes. The bread is wonderful fresh or toasted in a cast iron pan. Store leftovers in a sealed bag or container for up to 2 days on the counter or in the refrigerator for up to 5 days. You can also freeze leftover slices for a couple of months. The instructions for the bread pan loaf are similar to the freeform boule. Let me show you. Baking in a bread pan is the perfect plan B if you accidentally add too much water and your dough is soft and won't hold up as a freeform loaf. Consider adding the 1 to 2 extra tablespoons of water. Doing so could help with the rise and create an airier crumb. Experiment with different bread pans, as some could bake better loaves. Mine was smaller and had a cover. Again, mixing the dough for the boule, bread pan loaf, or buns is the same. The next few steps for the bread pan version are different, but easier. Transfer the mixed dough to the parchment-lined bread pan. If yours has a cover, use it. If not, cover the bread pan with a tea towel or plate. The appearance of this dough might differ from the freeform boule, especially if you did add a touch more water. You should see some growth after a few hours. Start preheating your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 to 60 minutes once you notice a 1/2 to 1 inch rise. Bake 40 minutes covered, 40 minutes uncovered. A baking stone is not necessary, but if you do have one, place the bread pan on top of it while baking. Like the freeform loaf, the bread is ready when the crust is hard, it has a nice golden color, and it sounds hollow when tapped all over. You can check the internal temperature, or if the sides feel too squishy, the loaf needs more time in the oven. Once ready, remove the loaf from the bread pan and cool on a wire rack for 4 to 6 hours before slicing. Using a bread knife with large, sharp teeth is best. Slicing your loaf upside down is a great trick as it makes it easier. Let me show you. The instructions to make the buns are easy, don't worry. Plus, they're fun to make. To begin, mix all your ingredients by hand or use a stand mixer. Leave the dough in the bowl and let it rise for 2 hours covered. Transfer your dough ball to a clean working surface dusted with brown rice flour. Divide the dough into 6 to 8 equal portions. You can use a large knife or dough scraper to help you. Use your hands to shape the dough into smoother balls. You might have to fold over the dough a few times to perfect the texture, and that's okay. Once on your parchment-lined baking sheet, flatten the dough to your preferred shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. The dough will poof up a bit when rising. I'll include a link to my gluten-free vegan sourdough rolls. Check it out. You'll see how I prepare the dough for that recipe. After making a few, it will get easier. Have fun with the process. You can tuck in the dough at the bottom and place the smoothest side up on a baking sheet. Before the next step, you can smooth out and fix the shape of each bun. For this batch, I brushed some olive oil on half the buns. With olive oil, the final color gets darker, but it doesn't change the taste. Cover the dough and rise for a few more hours. The dough will not double in size, but you should notice some growth. Don't forget to preheat the oven 30 to 60 minutes before you bake. Baking at 425 degrees Fahrenheit is perfect. If you have a baking stone, preheat it and place it under the baking sheet. For a little something extra, you can add seeds to each top if you wish. For 6 larger buns, bake for approximately 40 minutes on the metal rack. I flipped them over for the last 5 to 10 minutes. If after 40 minutes the buns still feel way too squishy, bake them for a few more minutes. If baking 8 smaller buns, the total time could be a little less. Once ready, let them cool on the pan for 10 minutes. Finish cooling on a wire rack before slicing and eating. Check it out, the buns have such a nice texture. Again, this recipe is gluten-free, egg-free, dairy-free, nut-free, no corn and/or legumes. Pretty incredible, really. In this picture, you can see the difference of the buns that were brushed with olive oil. They're a little darker. My favorite way to toast gluten-free sourdough bread is in a well-seasoned cast iron pan on low heat and toast slowly until perfection. If you have any questions about this recipe or any of the baking options, please let me know in the comments here or directly in the recipe post. The Baking Facebook group is also a great place to chat with others trying this recipe. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so yet, and I will see you in the next one.